Hi and welcome to the Cornwall Pride Show. I'm Matthew Kenworthy Gomez and we have the amazing Sophie Mayer with us from Queer Kerno, and we're not in the studio. So actually we are in the Royal Cornwall Museum and we are going to be going on Queer Kerno's LGBTQ plus history tour. Have I got that right?
Yes. So I'm from Queer Kerno and we are a community organisation that researches, promotes and just shares the amazing queer history of Cornwall. And what we've been doing is working with the museum to look at a few objects and create a bit of a tour of our LGBTQ heritage in the Royal Cornwall Museum.
Fantastic. And before we start, you've got something in your hand which is the Olden Gaze. What is
Olden
this?
Gaze. So the Olden Gaze is a zine that Queer Kerno have produced, and it's a bit of queer history. It's a map of different figures from around the county and the duchy, just kind of promoting different queer stories from our past.
Okay, so we're not talking about this person behind us.
We're not.
So where are we? However, they're obviously quite tall. They're the giant, as you described.
Cornish giant,
the Cornish
yes.
giant. Where are we going first?
So we're going to step back into prehistory.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're going to go to the Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age.
Which is how long?
About 7,000 years ago.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Let's get ourselves
Let's
there.
go.
So being here in the Royal Cornwall Museum in Truro, we have literally walked about 10 metres to the other side of the room. However, we've moved a whole 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, and we've got a sword and a mirror to talk about.
Yeah, so what we're talking about now is a Late Bronze Age, Early Iron Age burial. And in this burial was a sword and a mirror. Now, what really confused historians and archaeologists was, well, if there's a sword and a mirror in one burial, does that mean they're a man or a woman that's buried there?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this is how, historically, people have kind of worked out who's buried in what grave is based on what they're buried with. It's called grave goods, right?
Yeah.
So if someone is traditionally buried with a sword, they're considered male. If they're traditionally buried with, a mirror or cooking pots, female.
Okay.
So
wow.
A really, really old, outdated gender binary way of looking at things.
Yeah.
So we're here because this one burial on Briar, which is an island in the Isles of Scilly, had both a sword and a mirror. And it confounded people over which gender this burial was. Now, I think it's really interesting because why are we trying to put our modern perceptions of what's male and female onto something that's 5,000 years ago? We don't know what they would have considered gender back then. We know nothing about their kind of gender politics.
Yeah.
So why is modern history looking at these 5,000 years ago burials and saying that's a man or a woman based on my modern preconceptions?
Have they gone back to actually have a look at whether they were man or woman through their bones, or are there other ways of looking at it?
There are, and this is part of the new science. So because science is kind of caught up now, we can re-look at all these burials and actually look at the bones and see if there were sexed male or female. Yeah. Of course, that doesn't tell us about what gender they identified with. No. But it's better than assuming identity based on what objects they have. Well,
that kind of completely boggles me because with science, you're not there to assume. So that
exactly.
that sounds like almost a very interesting, not necessarily right way of being able to sex or gender a burial.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why when we get burials like the one on the Isles of Scilly, which isn't unique, where you've got a mixture of grave goods, it kind of just shows that this whole thinking about gender and how we understand the past should not be through our modern preconceptions.
Fab, thank you so much for that. And we're moving a bit forward in time?
Yeah, we're going to the Middle Ages.
Okay.
About 1200, 1250.
So 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Fantastic, all right.
Let's go.
And we've literally just walked from one side of the Royal Cornwall Museum to another. I think we're going to do all four corners of the Royal Cornwall Museum.
Yes, we are indeed.
And we are now in high medieval times?
Yeah, so think we're around 1250 to about 1350, around that period.
Okay.
So just before the Black Death hits in the Middle Ages. You got that?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about...
The plague.
The plague.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're talking about Edward II.
Yeah.
So Edward II and Piers Gaveston they grew up together. They spent loads of time together. They were they were in a relationship. Lots and lots of primary sources back up this assumption that it was beyond, sacred brotherhood, and actually it was a romantic and passionate and loving relationship. So what happened was, when they were younger, like I said, they grew up together. Edward I sent Piers away because everyone was a bit worried about how close they were getting. Yeah. And then when Edward II became king, obviously he brought Piers back from France, where he was in exile. And not only did they kind of restart their relationship, but he was given the earldom of Cornwall in 1307.
So is that the start of the earldom of Cornwall?
That is. So he was the very first Earl of Cornwall.
That's incredible.
And with that came Launceston Castle.
Okay.
Which, frankly, if your lover is given...
I just want to make the point that the first Earl of Cornwall was gay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And he got given a castle.
Wow.
Launceston Castle,
fantastic.
Which I love it there. So we've got an amazing Edward II. Yes. Piers Gaveston.
Earl of Cornwall.
First Earl of Cornwall.
And given Launceston Castle. That's one hell of a present.
It really is, yeah. And one of the primary sources is Robert of Reading, who was a monk writing at the time, and he said that Edward mistrusted or gave over the loving, tender embrace of his wife into illicit and sinful unions with Piers Gaveston.
Oh, wow.
Which I think is pretty...
That's pretty kind of explanation.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is what... I find so fascinating, is that there are primary sources for all these stories, and they've just been kind of misremembered and straightened out over time. Yeah. So part of this tour is about re-queering the past and saying that, they were gay and they were homosexual and had same-sex attraction, and it is in there in the evidence. We just haven't been told that.
So what happened to Piers?
Okay, so Piers and Edward II had a bit of a rocky relationship. Okay. So because Edward II gave Piers Gaveston so much patronage, which means he was showered with gifts, showered with money from the crown, wow. The other courtiers got really, really jealous of this. Yeah. And it wasn't necessarily the fact that they were in a relationship. It was more of the fact that he was getting so much money and so many gifts, and he had so much political sway. Favoritism, basically. Okay. So what happened is there was a bit of upheaval at court, and it became really nasty, to the point where Edward II had to flee, and Piers Gaveston actually was beheaded in 1312.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Okay. Very tragic end.
Very tragic end to the story, but I think important to know.
Yeah, and what happened to Edward II afterwards? He flee, and that was...
Well, after Piers Gaveston had been beheaded, the courtiers kind of thought, well, our biggest kind of problem is dealt with. So he had a bit of a rocky end, but he kept his kingdom.
Anyone keen to give us the castle, Launceston Castle? Yeah, we're happy with that?
Yeah. No, I take it.
Yeah, fantastic. Brilliant. So where are we going to next?
Oh, we are going to the 19th century.
Oh, so that's a massive jump.
Massive jump.
Okay, so we'll see you in a sec.
Yeah.
So we are in the final corner of the main room of the Royal Cornwall Museum, and a little bit of a challenging conversation that we're about to have, so please do bear with us. So Sophie, you've taken us here because homosexuality has only recently been decriminalised, and I say only recently, like 70 odd years. But what's down there?
So down here we've got a police section.
Okay.
And it's all from the 19th century, so that's the 1800s.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I'm bringing us here is because part of my research has been digging into the archives, trying to find Cornish men and women who were penalised by the law for being gay.
Yeah.
And sadly, there are quite a few examples of this happening.
Yeah.
So one story that I'm going to tell you about actually has a bit of a good angle as well. So we're talking about the case of Ernst Oak and William Davey, who were convicted in 1888 of what was called gross indecency, which is what basically a sodomy charge, bestiality charge, or anything kind of gross indecent that they were called back in that time period. I'm only using these words because those are the words written in the records. So these two were actually in the Duke of Cornwall Light Infantry. They were soldiers. Now, I only found this out with quite a lot of digging because they were discharged from the army and their discharge papers were predated to their offence. So that in the newspapers, when it was being reported on, it wouldn't say William Davey, soldier at the Duke of Cornwall Light Infantry, it would say William Davey, labourer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Because I would assume it would have been quite a scandal for two
Yes.
people to be in the infantry and together.
Yeah, absolutely,
Wow.
especially in the 1880s.
Yeah.
So when I say this has a bit of a positive spin, it's because the case of Oak and Davey, and what happened to them, I should say, is that Ernst Oak, as a couple of years older than Davey, was seen as the instigator. Now, back then, you have to think the court of law was always looking for someone who kind of elicited that person into committing a sinful act. It was never, because it was illegal, it couldn't be seen as consensual.
Yeah.
So Ernst Oak was actually given life imprisonment.
Wow.
Yeah. And William Davey was given, it was life imprisonment, but commuted down.
Okay.
Because he was the younger gentleman.
Right.
So what's interesting about this is this case actually went to the Secretary of State in Parliament as a discussion for why mandatory minimums should be taken away for these kinds of cases. So a mandatory minimum for someone committing an unnatural offence is life imprisonment.
Wow.
Yeah. So in 1891, this actually changed, and they got rid of the mandatory minimum. And William Davey and Ernst Oak, their case was put forward to the Secretary of State as an example of why this shouldn't happen, about why mandatory minimums actually just penalise people. So it's the very, very beginnings of the loosening of criminality for homosexuals.
It's really interesting to talk about when, because there was never a law around lesbian acts or women acts.
Yes.
Just for men, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the kind of history around that is because it was suggested that lesbianism be added to the Criminality Acts, but it was actually considered as not really a thing to even bother.
It didn't exist?
It didn't exist.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so when did it become legal?
So it became legal in 1967, was the partial decriminalisation.
Okay. Wow.
Yes. So heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it's really not comforting, but also, I don't know, kind of fires me up a bit that you think that a case from Cornwall actually helped change the law.
Yeah.
In Parliament in 1891.
Just incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. Thank you. And we're going to go upstairs now.
Yes.
How far are we going back? Are we go further back or are we going forward?
We're going back into history.
Okay.
We're going to about 1650. Just after the Tudors.
Okay, fine. Fantastic.
There we
Thank
go.
you. So 300 years.
Yeah.
Fab. So we are in the 17th century, so 1600s.
Yeah.
and there's a snuff box.
Yeah, so this is a snuff box, but what makes it interesting is it belonged to Nell Gwyn.
Okay.
So Nell Gwyn was an actress, and what she did was originate breeches roles. So a breeches role is obviously involves breeches,
Yeah.
and it was the first time women were allowed to appear on stage wearing breeches. So playing with that kind of gender identity on the stage, which is really quite groundbreaking for the 17th century.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Was she renowned for any particular type of plays that she played, or?
She was renowned for being Charles II's mistress.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And he actually saw her because she was performing on the stage.
Okay.
Which is kind of why she became famous for her breeches roles. Because back then, if you imagine what women would have worn, like big kind of Tudor type dresses, right? With the big hoops.
Yeah. Okay.
And all of a sudden, you're wearing something tight fitting that shows off your legs. And that was considered very salacious.
And risque and
risque.
A little bit. Okay.
Yes.
Before we move on, what actually is a snuff box?
Okay, so a snuff box would have held opium.
Okay. So they would have been able to kind of recreational drugs.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. And we're still staying upstairs.
We are.
Are we going to see, is it a Charles?
William III.
William III. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll get my kings right.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Shall we?
Yeah. So we've literally just moved across from like the gallery section of the Royal Cornwall Museum from the snuff box to a plate
Yes.
of...
William III.
Okay.
1650s to 1700s, talking about the late 17th century now.
Okay. He's very grand.
He is very grand. He's very, regal and authoritative on his horse there.
Flowing curly hair.
Oh yeah, loved his massive locks.
Yeah. And you can definitely know the sex of the horse as well, which is quite interesting.
yeah, it's nice and obvious.
Yeah.
So, did you know William III was a homosexual?
No.
And I'm using homosexual because this is the terminology they would have used.
Okay.
Same-sex attraction, homosexuality. So he had numerous long-term relationships. So you know how you get the traditional king and he's got the mistresses on the sides?
Yeah.
So this king...
Just traditional.
Well, in English history, you've got,
Okay.
think Henry VIII with his...
Yeah. Okay.
So William III had the same, but his mistresses were actually other men.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was very famous for never really paying much attention to his wife because he wasn't really that way inclined.
Okay.
So we know that there were two main men in William III's life, and that's Albert Keppel and William Bentnick. So those two, a bit like before when we were talking about Piers Gaveston getting loads and loads of honours and earldoms, same thing happened here.
Wow.
So these two, while they were in favour with William III, were given lots of money, lots of patronage. They were given earldoms, and it's quite obvious what was going on there.
It's quite interesting we're talking about this, and we're talking about history in a way that these people are fairly privileged. We're talking kings and queens and such. Why is that?
I mean, that's because as a king or a queen, so much is written about your life during the time you are alive.
Yeah.
And those primary sources are where we get really, really good information about who they are.
So when we're talking about queer history, we're only really scratching the surface with the elements of information, because we've come through, it's quite a large museum, there's lots of artefacts and lots of history here, and we've picked up 6 different elements out of the whole of the museum so far, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, and this is what Queer Kerno is trying to do, is scratch beyond the surface and really find those local stories to Cornwall. And what I think is really interesting is that even, we're talking about kings and queens, but even this very basic information isn't disseminated out in education. You didn't know Edward II was with Piers Gaveston. You wouldn't know that William III had male lovers, because this information has been straightened out over time.
There's a period of history which, as you just said, straightened out queer history. What was that period?
So that was the Victorian period.
Okay.
And they have a lot to answer for.
Wow.
So, during the Victorian period is when we consider that traditional historiography, so that's people writing about history, really kind of got going in England. And it's during this period that, they straightened out history. I mean, it was during the Victorian period that the British Museum had an entire room that filled with queer stuff that they just hid away because it wasn't for public view.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary.
They had like a secret vault.
And I'm fascinated about a particular story. What happened with, I was going to say,
You're getting Frederick the Great, aren't you?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, but I was thinking about something else then. So I'm fascinated about a particular story, which we're going to go to in ancient Greek and Roman times. But before we do, we've got another piece just here.
We've got one more on this gallery, yes.
Okay.
So.
Okay, love museums. We've moved 3 steps and we're 100 years on.
Yeah, yes,
where are we?
So we're in the 1750s, 1760s, and it's Frederick the Great. Okay.
Yeah.
So these teapots here, number 30 has his coat of arms on.
Yeah.
And so Frederick the Great of Prussia. So we're talking about Eastern Europe, quite a few hundred years ago. So our modern conception of countries didn't really exist.
Kind of somewhere near Russia.
Somewhere near Russia, yeah. He was actually, as we would say now, very effeminate growing up. They didn't have a word for effeminate back in the 1760s. But from all the kind of modern understanding, he was written about as very feminine in his attributes, with long hair and, didn't like killing people and that kind of thing. Which I don't know is effeminate or just a normal human being response.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when his father found out he had a lover, his father actually killed his lover in front of him, which is fairly heavy for a young boy.
Anyone to... Yeah, absolutely.
So Frederick was sent away to France as kind of an exile to think about his sins, really kind of, it's really obvious that he was sent away because of this relationship.
Yeah.
And there he got a bit rich boy crazy, you could say.
Okay. What did he do?
So there was lots of kind of acting out, lots of killings of the lower classes, and that kind of thing. Which I think, as a historian, this is just my view, that it's a trauma response from what he went through growing up.
So from Frederick the Great and 1760. We're going to go further back in time?
Yeah, we're going back to the ancient Romans and Greeks.
Fantastic. So we've now moved into the ancient civilization part of the museum. So we've got the ancient Greeks, the Romans and the Egyptians. You're going to show us Alexander the Great?
Yes. So Alexander the Great, whose coin is in this cabinet.
Yeah.
He is considered great because he was king of Macedonia, which is in ancient Greece, or near ancient Greece. And he is a famous, possibly the most famous military leader in history, which is why he's considered great. He expanded his empire from North Africa to Asia to Europe. It was massive.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, really massive.
And he was gay?
Well, we don't know for certain. We know he was queer. Which is a word I prefer to use when we're talking about ancient civilizations, because their understanding of gay and straight didn't really exist. That's our modern understanding of same-sex relationships. But we definitely know that he had a very long, loving relationship with his friend Hephaestion.
So with Alexander the Great and Hephaestion, was this a common type of relationship that would happen in those times?
Yeah, absolutely. So in ancient Greece particularly, but also in ancient Rome, you had this kind of role model and teacher-student relationship between men that was exceptionally common. And what's interesting about Hephaestion and Alexander is they were both students together under Aristotle. And when they were students, they had this really loving relationship, but they never grew out of it. And that was quite common in ancient Greece, that it was accepted, that you'd have the kind of older gentleman being like the teacher and showing them, it would be a sexual relationship, but also literary and educational and, offering patronage, really.
Wow.
And then as the kind of younger man would grow out of that tutelage, he would then become the tutor to another relationship.
How do we know that this relationship was as it was?
Because of the amount of primary sources.
Okay.
So there are so many primary accounts of the love between them. And after Hephaestion died, only a couple of years, I think, before Alexander, Alexander was utterly distraught.
Yeah.
And, tried to ask, Alexander was utterly distraught at Hephaestion's death, and it's said in many primary sources that he couldn't move on without his greatest love.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So from Alexander the Great in Greece or to Rome?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're just going over there. And the most amazing parts about museum spaces is exhibitions change. So we're going to be coming back in another day to see who?
Lord Frederick Leighton and Singer Sargent.
Fantastic.
Yeah, both artists.
Oh, wow. Incredible paintings. We've seen them before, so very excited to see that in a sec.
Yeah. Similar.
Okay. I don't know nothing about history. So this is a little bit different because we've been looking at kind of artifacts. Obviously, they had the paint and the drawing or painting on the drawings, but these are drawings.
These are
paintings?
drawings, yes.
Okay.
So now we're in the paintings gallery, you could say. So what we've got here are two Singer Sargent drawings, and in the middle is a Lord Frederick Leighton painting.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and what's fun is that everyone on this wall is gay.
Yay! Okay. So what the Singer Sargent drawings? Who was he?
So Singer Sargent was a really famous artist in around the late 1800s to the early 1900s, and he is kind of famous for doing lots of naked male bodies, much like these, which are a study of two archers, actually. You can see they've got the pose.
Definitely my type of drawings.
Yeah.
Happy with those. And we've got you took something about Polari.
Yeah, so this is Lord Frederick Leighton. Now, what's fascinating about him is that in the last couple of years, his love letters have actually come out to Henry Greville, or rather Henry Greville's love letters to him.
Okay.
He was always suspected of being gay because, as he said, that his artwork has a lot of coded imagery. So really iconically for a kind of 1800s painting, you've got these two doves, which is a really kind of big sign in kind of 1900s artwork that, it's a nod to homosexuality. Wow.
And the vase, and talking about it is a very, very suggestive.
It is, and the
painting.
pose as well. So Singer Sargent and Lord Leighton, they're of a time period where, as you mentioned, Polari, it's a coded language, which other gay men would kind of respond to in kind.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we see here, but in art form rather than language form. So you get these little nuggets, which other people visiting an art gallery would be like, oh, I know what that means. That's a secret message for me. And you find that in Lord Leighton's paintings quite a lot.
Incredible. So we've just done a tour, the Queer Kerno tour of the Royal Cornwall Museum.
Yes.
Of artefacts and paintings of queer history from Cornwall, from the UK and from Europe.
Yeah.
What else has Queer Kerno done and what's your plans?
So if you go to our website, we've actually done a queer history of Cornwall. So whereas our tour here is looked at nationally and internationally, we kind of focus on just the Cornish stories and exploring our own history down here in Cornwall. And we work with galleries and museums around Cornwall, look into their archives, look into their collections, and just find and celebrate these queer stories.
What I find fascinating as well is it doesn't need to be 3,000 years old. History is happening now. So there's loads of incredible queer stories that are happening in Cornwall. We visited something this weekend, which was extraordinary.
It was.
The first ever, I'll say sober, queer safe space in Cornwall, curated by young people of Yay in Cornwall, which is the Scene exhibition.
I know, I love the Scene exhibition.
What's your thoughts on that?
Oh my goodness, I think it's an incredible collection of community artwork alongside Cornish artists. You've got some really amazing Cornish artists, along with national artists like Francis Bacon, all put in this one room. And it's just, I don't know about you, but the Cornwall Pride rainbow flag over the ceiling just makes it feel cozy and welcoming and warming, and honestly, brings tears. It
was a nod to the community. So that exhibition runs from the 23rd to the 8th of January at the Exchange in Penzance, curated by the incredible Sharp artist. Hopefully be able to go down there and visit it again. Otherwise, we'll get to see you in a couple of weeks' time in the Cornwall Pride Show. Really hope you have enjoyed our journey through time, through queer history and celebrating queer history right here in Cornwall, with some tragic ends, but with some beautiful, beautiful stories of incredible people.